All right, welcome everyone to Ubuntu, a global dialogue with Africa. I am Kalu Osiri, and it's a pleasure to be with you today and to explore an important discussion, an important topic that hovers around our collective identity. The topic for today is, are you Black or African? We're going to explore the psychology, the sociology, the history of our collective identity. I think it's very important that we tackle this issue, or at least we start thinking about it, because having a sense of identity is very critical. There has been no nation, there has been no people, no civilization that advanced and thrived without knowing very clearly who they were. But you and I can agree today that in our community, in the African community, or some might say in the Black community, there is some sort of identity crisis. And we can point fingers, we can trace that crisis to so many things in history. But let's think about what our identity should be. What ideally should it look like? So oftentimes we hear Black, I'm a Black person, I'm a Black man, I'm a Black woman, I'm Black, and then some say, but I'm African. So let's explore, let's dive in. But before we dive in, let me give you my position. And my position has come about after years of thinking and experiences and evolution. So I have evolved over time. I've come to believe that using the term Black does two things. One, it separates us from our true identity as Africans. It sort of pushes us back a little bit. That's number one. Because when we say Black, yes, I think we have tended to forge a new identity or a new culture around the name Black. But what I'm arguing is it separates us from our authentic Africanness. And so we need to take a critical look at that. My second reason for staying away from the term Black is that it creates or even exacerbates racism. In other words, when we say that we are Black, we're essentially unknowingly framing our identity in diametrically opposite to another that call themselves white. And again, we're going to explore this a little bit. So please, I really welcome you to chime in. If you have questions, please, by all means, use the Q&A. Ask questions. If you want to contribute, please do let us know too, and we'll love to hear your voice as well. So I'm gonna tackle this topic for the first hour with you, of course, and then in the second hour, I will have my brother, Dr. Jose Pimiente Bay, join to make his contribution as well. So now, if you look back into history, what do you see? You notice that people who look like us, people who have dark skin, that way, were called Nigers or Nigers or Nigers, however you want to say that. But the spelling is Nigers. And that term, Nigers or Nigers, first appeared in 1574. in reference to the Nigers of Ethiopia. And at that time, it wasn't used in a derogatory manner. Now, in the early 1600s, around 1619, to be a little precise, enslaved Africans were called Negers or Negers, spelling Negars. Now, at that point, it was a name that was used to describe the enslaved people. So the people who were using this terminology didn't intend it to be derogatory in a sense. They were just naming what they had, and then in that instance, they had enslaved these people, so they call them Negers or Negers, Negars. But in the 1700s, especially in the late 1700s, it became a very derogatory term. So it became the N-word, the N-word that we call today, that we use today, that we're all familiar with. So that is a sense where this word is coming from. Okay, so in the 1700s, the late 1700s, 1775, if you want to put a year around it, the word negers began to be used in a derogatory manner, okay, to talk down on dark-skinned people. Now, what we find is over time, there was a pushback, right? So in 1851, for example, after there was some sort of modernization coming in America, a sort of a wind of consciousness blowing through America. The northern states in America began to prefer to use the term Negro or colored over the term nigger or the N-word that we use today. So we begin to see this evolution. From the N-word, we now came down to Negro. And in fact, the term Negro became very popular. And throughout the civil rights movement, it was very popular. Martin Luther King, the great Martin Luther King, used it to describe the people that he was fighting for, the African Americans, the blacks. So it became Negro. So from N-word to Negro, or sometimes the colored people. And you are even familiar with the NAACP, created an association in 1909 called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. So it would be used interchangeably at that time in the early 1900s, colored versus Negro. But then again, over time, the word Negro also began to fall out of use, and folks began to prefer Black over Negro. Now, keep in mind, Negro is Black in Spanish. Okay, so it was during the civil rights movement in the 1960s, around that time, where you see a great use of the term Negro, but also a gentle introduction of the term Black as well. And in fact, Negro remained on the books, even on the US Census, until very recently. Let me see, it was just until 2013, that the US Census dropped the term Negro. Okay. 2013, the term Negro was dropped from the US Census. And in 2016, President Obama signed into law to strike out the use of Negro and to use African American instead. So the term African American became in vogue and became law, at least in terms of U.S. Tracking and census, just in 2016. And along the same time, Negro was replaced with African American. The term Oriental, which was used to describe people of Asian ancestry, was also replaced by the law Obama signed with Asian African. Okay. So essentially, what we see is an evolution. See an evolution of terms from the N word to Negro to Black, which is very popular now. But then, but along the same time, we had the term Black introduced, African American also now has been signed into law very recently. So that is a brief history of the terms.
Solutions. The first one is having strong self-esteem. And I believe it's very difficult to have strong self-esteem if you don't know who you are, if you don't have a positive affiliation with Africa. Then you're not Negro, you're not colored, you're not Black, you're not Afro-American, you're African. And until we accept that, until we like the texture of our hair, the color of our eyes, our hue, then it's going to be very difficult to do well in life.
All right. So he said that you are not colored, you are not Black, you are African. And until we come to terms that we are Africans, that will never really see the light of the day, just to paraphrase him. So again, I'll be curious to hear your thoughts. Put in your chats, in the chat room, your thoughts. And if you have questions, let's go ahead and explore them as well. You know, now I strongly believe, I believe that there are well-meaning folks, Blacks, or Africans, African Americans, and I'm using the term liberal, these terms liberally because we know people who might be on this platform who have a certain attachment to the different terms. So out of respect, I am using the term Black right now. And they've come to use that term because of a movement that also came around during the civil rights movement. You probably are aware of the idea of being Black and being proud. So we've gotten to essentially sanitize the term, and it was an effort to take it back, to sort of own it, so to speak, right? And so I understand that some people love themselves and love who they are, and they don't have any issues with their African identity, but they want to be called Black. So I do understand that. But there's a lot of issues with the term Black. And I just played that clip for you to see an angle from a scholar, an African scholar, an African American scholar who has something to say about that. Okay, so somebody says here, the problem with African American is how would you define a white South African or a Moroccan immigrant in the US? Now, there is no doubt that there's even African American is not perfect. Okay. But in my book, I think there is sort of a gradient. African American for me is certainly better than Black, because at least it reminds you of your African background, of your African ancestry. So it's certainly better than saying Black, because when you say Black, you are essentially just pointing to the skin to the color of your skin, and not to your culture. So that's why I prefer African American over Black. Now, in an ideal world, every American citizen should just be called an American in an ideal world. Okay? But since we don't have an ideal world, I would say we have African Americans and we have European Americans. I don't call anybody white too. I've also evolved along those lines too. I don't call anybody white. I call them people you may want to call white. I call them European Americans, the same way I will call somebody an African American. But ideally, I will prefer to just call all Americans Americans and leave it at that. Okay, let's see if there are any more questions coming in. Yes, we do have questions. Yes, so Dr. Paul Easterling says, Dr. John Henry Clark, a great African American, a great African scholar, says the term Black tells us what we look like, but does not tell us who we are. Absolutely, I agree to that statement. All right, so I'm just trying to make the case here why we should attach ourselves to the term African. We should not run away from it. We should make peace as Africans and enjoy our rich African heritage.
To be done by each and every one of us. If you had the right to say, I, James Baldwin, will tell people what to do and how to solve this thing, what would you say?
My God.
Yeah, it's a tough
In 3 words?
Not in 3 words, no, a single thing. For example, I happen to think, just to give you an idea of what I'm getting at, that the most important thing at the moment now is jobs.
That's quite true. But the nature of the problem, as I see it, is so complex that one can't simply say jobs. One has to say jobs, schools, houses. It's a whole complex of things, you know. Jobs alone won't solve it. Schools alone won't solve it. It's in the social fabric, you know.
It isn't anything, it's everything.
It's everything. And I really think, to come back to Joe's point in another way, and at the risk of sounding mystical, that the first step probably has to be somewhere in the American conscience. I think the American white republic has to ask itself why it was necessary for them to invent the nigger. You know, I am not a nigger. You know, I never called myself one. But one comes into the world, and the world decides that you are this for its own reasons. And it is very important, I think, for the American, in terms of the future, in terms of his health, in terms of the transformation we are all seeking, that he faced this question, that he needed the nigger for something. You know.
May I please be forgiven for interrupting? In fact, we have run out of time.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Also, Dr. Clark said, our name must reflect 3 things. 1, it must reflect our land, our history, and our culture. Thank you very much for that contribution, Dr. Easterling. Dr. Easterling is our Olga of humanities. So I should have actually had him with me on this panel here. So, but thank you for another contribution. Is in our different African countries, we have different ethnic groups, yet I never heard anybody being called or referring to their national identity. Yoruba Nigerian, Igbo Nigerian, Bobo Burkinabe, Mosi Burkinabe, we are Nigerians, Malians, Burkinabe, and so on and so forth. That is a great point. And in fact, ideally, we should be Yorubas. I mean, that is who we are. We should be Bobos. We should be Mosis, the Zulus, and the Kikuyus, the Ewe's, the Ashantis. That is really who we are. And the reason that's very important, this is so important, is because if we are going to maintain our culture, then we have to call ourselves by our true names, which is what I just rattled, right? And there are several of them. There are over 3,000 of them. Because by attaching yourself to these cultures, then you can now talk about speaking the language, you can talk about learning the cultural practices and so on and so forth, and that's how you keep it alive. So I think it's important that we actually go even deeper as Africans and not just settle at the country level, because at the country level, we actually also lose our culture. So it's important we attach ourselves to those specific identities. Now, obviously, when we come together as Africans, then the question becomes, what do we call ourselves? Okay, so I think that this is where we are now saying that we are Africans makes the most sense. All right. Okay, so someone is saying African American was the term invented by Jesse Jackson in 1988. And so thank you for that comment. Now the challenge with using Black, somebody else is adding here, is that it takes away out our Africanness. Yes, I agree with you, because there are Black people in Colombia, in Brazil, and they are not necessarily African. In other words, they're not from the continent. But by using Black, it takes out Africanness. So that is the contribution. One is either African or not. Period. Okay, thank you for that contribution. Let me play something else for you again that I think this will really hit home. This is one of the main reasons why I strongly advocate for the term African, and I think we should do away with the term Black. There is a psychology involved. There's a psychological aspect to this. In the English language, the term Black has or is loaded with lots of negative connotations. It's just in the English language. That is just a fact. And the term white has a lot of pleasant and beautiful connotations, right? So, and this is something you cannot really help, because you cannot help your brain. When your brain has been exposed to the negativities that has been associated with the term Black, and then you call yourself Black, it's just hard for the brain to automatically disentangle the negativity associated with that term and you as a person. That's another issue. That is the psychology of the term. And on the other hand, the term white accrues a lot of benefits to those that go with the term white, because in the English language, white is associated with so many beautiful things, with purity and so on and so forth. So let me play this. TED Talk.
I have also learned how the negative stereotypes and images of Blacks in our culture literally create and sustain both institutional and individual discrimination. A group of researchers have put together a database that contains the books, magazines, and articles that the average college-educated American would read over their lifetime. It allows us to look within this database and see how Americans have seen words paired together as they grew up in this society. So when the word Black appears in American culture, what co-occurs with it? Poor, violent, religious, lazy, cheerful, dangerous. When white occurs, the frequently co-occurring words are wealthy, progressive, conventional, stubborn, successful, educated. So when a police officer overreacts when he sees an unarmed Black male and perceives him to be violent and dangerous, we are not necessarily dealing with an inherently bad cop. We may be simply viewing a normal American who is reflecting what he has been experiencing.
Now, remember I was saying earlier that the terms themselves, have connotations. So the term Black has negative connotations. You talk about blackmailing, you talk about the black sheep of the family, Black associated with death. So that is one aspect of it. On the other hand, the term white is associated with good things, beautiful things. You have the term, you have the idea of purity, you have the idea of innocence, the idea of cleanliness. So this is just something that is really embedded in the language itself. On top of that, which is what we just watched, on top of the embedded meanings, you also have this cultural meanings that come with it, right? Which you just heard. In the case of Black, you have dangerous and violent and so on and so forth. In the case of white, you have wealthy, educated, and so on and so forth. So this is really a huge mountain to overcome, and this is why I try to tell some people, say, it's not as if that, we don't want to use the term Black. I mean, the word itself doesn't have power, but because of the connotations it comes with, then it has cachet. Someone says, I may have missed this, but the term Black is not the color of African skin. That's another point, right? The term Black is not necessarily, I mean, there are Africans who are Black. There are those Africans who are Black, and we are proud of that. But many other Africans are brown skin, right? So that is a good contribution. So why do African Americans accept the term Black? In other words, if they are not really Black in terms of their skin color. Okay. All right. So someone says, don't be afraid to define things for yourself. It is going to be essential for our development. We can't get bogged down in these nuances, whether we are Black or African, although it is important to consider. Absolutely. Again, we can't get bogged down. That is true. And we must focus on important work, such as building out good educational systems, good economic systems. Those are the important works that we must do. But if you remember, I also talked about having a strong sense of identity. And if you don't get your identity right, it can affect you. So it's important that as we focus on this important work, that we think about how we are framing ourselves, how we are identifying ourselves. Yes, we cannot get bogged down. At the same time, we must also consider whether using the term helps us or whether it actually works against us. And based on this research I just showed you from the Harvard professor, it actually negatively affects us in some ways, right? Africans is what would be the best term for all of us. I agree with you. Okay, very nice. Thank you for that input. It just, again, the idea of focusing on the skin color, in my opinion, is not really a good idea. It works against us. I think it's important for us to focus on our culture, because when we focus on our culture as Africans, then we are actually making contribution. We're actually talking about who we are as opposed to what we look like. Okay. Okay. Let me, I'm gonna share one more thing with you here. I'm gonna share one more thing with you here that many of you may not actually be aware of, but this is very important as you think about the term Black. Did you know that there was a time in history when the US went through great pain to identify people as Black or a variation of Black? Again, coming back to this idea of pinning you based on what you look like. So here is the instruction to census takers in 1890. Here's the instruction. The word black should be used to describe those persons who have 3/4 or more black blood. You hear that? 3/4 or more black blood. This is just the obsession about what persons look like and not focusing on who they are or their character. It goes even further. They have another term too, a variation of black called mulatto. This is the US Census now. Mulatto describes those persons who have from 3/8 to 5/8 black blood. Okay, this is why I strongly oppose the idea of calling myself black or calling others black. And again, if you want to stick to it, that's fine. But just want to keep in mind, this is where this is coming from. This is how it's been used. It's been used to box you in. It's been used to box you in. And they went through great lengths to make sure that the darker you are, they put you in certain categories. That way they can treat you even more differently, right? Okay, so that is mulatto. So mulatto, persons who have from 3/8 to 5/8 black blood. It goes even further. Quadroon. Quadroon, those persons who have 1/4 black blood. And then octoroon. It gets ridiculous. But you may laugh, it gets ridiculous here. But this is the US Census, this is the US government. This is our society doing this. Octoroon, if you have 1/8 or any trace of black blood, right? So this is what they have made the blackness to be. And then again, let me say that many of us didn't know this. We didn't know this. And I'm well aware of the black movement, the Black Power movement. I am black and I'm proud. It was an effort to sort of take that term, sanitize it, and make it look good again, or make it look good in English. But it was never really intended to be good, as you could see here, right? So so it's important that we have this historical context as we move forward. Okay, let's see. Let me see. I think there are some more questions that came in. Yes, the one drop rule. Absolutely. If you have a one drop, then yes, you are called the octoroon, and so on and so forth. Osiri, you are putting on a white shirt, but that is not how the white folks look. Absolutely. So white or black is a wrong identification of persons. Absolutely. This is white, right? So I don't call anybody white. I don't call anybody white. I will say European Americans or African Americans, right? So that is how I will go. That's how I will go about that. And I think you should try it too. You shouldn't call people white because nobody is white. So the same way they created the term black, as you saw from what I just read, and went through great lengths in parceling things out. If you have this one drop of blood, 1/8, 1/4, and so on and so forth, they put you in different categories. That was also how they manufactured the term white for their benefits. So for me, I reject both of them. I reject both of them. When I had my son at the hospital, they gave us a form, to fill out. The form, you have to fill out, your name and the information about you, and you have to also indicate your race, right? There's the black or African, there's African American, there's white, and this is the funny part too. On the form that I had to fill out, when it came to the section about race, instead of listing it in alphabetical order, the first thing that I saw was white. Then right under it was Black or African. And then everything else was listed in alphabetical order. So I skipped the whole thing and I wrote mine in human. Because that's what I prefer to put in there. Again, I've evolved. I've never always had this mindset, but through research and digging into history like this, I just came to find out that this was actually developed to be used against us, as you can see from the U.S. Census, right? So I encourage you, to try to use the term African, if you may, if you have an African ancestry, to describe yourself, and when necessary, you may have to say African American, right? The same way you would say European American, and then don't call anybody white. Use European American. Write about the issue of connotation as it relates to color. For instance, in weddings you have white wedding, you have white weddings, Black Death. Jesus is associated with whiteness and angels, and devil is associated with being black and demons and so on and so forth. So yes, I agree with you, brother. It was a leaky there. Okay, so somebody asking, what would be the connection between Africans with a K and Africans with a C? Which one should we adopt? Okay, so that's a good question. So for me, I actually started using African with a K. People have been using Africana with a K, but it's Africana. Or Africana with a C, but it's still Africana. You may have heard Africana studies and so on and so forth. But I use the Africa with a K or Africans with a K to include Africans on the continent, Africans in the diaspora, Africans all over the world. It's more like a way to sort of bring folks into the fold gently, because some folks, I know that some folks are still, let me just say, maybe they are not proud of their African background or the African ancestry. And so, I use the term African to say, okay, here's a broader term that is more inclusive. And when you look at that term, it causes you to ask questions, okay, why K? Then I can then explain that, okay, that means Africans who are currently on the continent, African Americans, Africans in the Caribbean, and so on and so forth. So that is why I use the K. But in all reality, Africans with a K are really Africans with a C. We are from the same stock. We are the same people. And the same way European Americans who are here are essentially Europeans by ancestry and who landed here. So that is the connection, and that is how I will answer that question. Okay, somebody says Ethiopia literally means burnt-faced people. The Greeks gave Ethiopia that name. Should they abandon that name? Well, I mean, I think that is a question for Ethiopians to consider. If they need to abandon that name, I mean, let's face it, even Nigeria wasn't named by Africans. It was named by the British, right? So there are many African countries that were named by British. So these are some things that we have to grapple with as we decolonize, right? So what I say is, do what you can in your space. What can you do? Like, I just gave you an example of what I did when I went to go when I was filling out a form, right? So that's something I can do in my space. But yes, if you want to think about it in terms of decolonizing our names, decolonizing our education, it might make sense to think about those names. I agree with you. It might make sense to do that, but but what can we do now? At least for now, you can definitely call yourself an African. Nobody's to ask you who are you. You can say African as opposed to saying black, right? So that is the argument that I will make there. Okay, how do you address the fact that among some African Americans, they don't want to be called Africans because it suggests that Africans, it suggests Africans who came here as recent immigrants. How does this impact this attempt to change the nomenclature? Okay, true. There are some African Americans who don't want to call themselves African because Africans refer to Africans who are recent immigrants. But I shared a video earlier with you from Dr. Jawanza Kundufu. He's African American himself, right? He's a well-known author, and he says until all African people, including African Americans, until they drop the term colored, drop the term black, and identify themselves as Africans, that they will never see the light of the day. It'll be hard for them to move forward. Okay, you cannot understand your identity if you can't name it, if you can't even begin to research it, right? So that is one way to think about it. I mean, understand there is in one sense, you would have to, or African Americans will have to say, okay, I'm an African. It doesn't mean that they have to go about saying this all the time. There might be a time where it will make sense for them to identify themselves as African Americans or as Americans because they are still Americans too. Politically, they are Americans. I mean, if they are running for office, for example, I don't think they should go around calling themselves Africans, right, in America. What we're talking about is when it comes to identifying with your roots, having an emotional connection, having a psychological connection to your roots, then yes, of course, they should call themselves Africans. When they are having discussions at home, again, within that sphere that you can control, amongst friends, they can call themselves Africans. Nobody stops them from doing that, right? So obviously, I mean, we have to apply this with wisdom. And if they're out there, they have to fill out a form. Of course, they're African Americans, or they are, like I said earlier, they're actually American. So I would say they are bona fide Americans, and I would say they are bona fide Africans, right? The same way European Americans are Europeans, but they are also European Americans or Americans. It's just the same way, right? But on the form or when they are running for office, you wouldn't expect someone with a European ancestry to be calling themselves European or European American. No, this is a different time. They are running for office, right? So we have to apply wisdom as we deal with this thing. Okay, somebody says, you know, he prefers African with a K because it has this Pan-African connection and movement globally. Dr. Noble says, I think it's important to clarify that all Blacks, wherever they live, are Africans. Okay. All right. So Dr. Paul Easterling comes back. He says, Nexus is a term. Negos is a term that some are starting to embrace. Language of the naming issue is still in flux. It might be useful to use a word of African origin. I agree with that. I prefer to use words with African origin. If you notice what we are doing at the Osiri University, we are using words from different ethnic backgrounds to describe ourselves. If you're an advisor, we call you an omukulu, right? If you're a teacher, we say malame, which is an Hausa term for teacher, right? If you are a head of a school, or if you're leading a school, you're a leader, we call you Oga, which is a Yoruba term for head or for someone who's leading an entity. We call you Oga. So yes, I agree with the idea of using African terms. Let's go back to our roots and use those terms. Why not? Naming equals identity. which is critically important. Thank you again, Dr. Easterling. Unfortunately, many African Americans don't like the term African. That is the issue. So this is something I've also, I would say, sort of noticed, but I'm not sure about it. Because on one hand, people will say, okay, I'm proud to be, to be of an African descent. But then they would choose to say blacks as opposed to African American or something of that sort. So yeah, but here's an African American telling us here that, hey, the term African, African Americans don't like the term African because of the negative connotation that the Europeans gave it. The Europeans have called Africans uncivilized, they have called Africans ignorant, and so on and so forth. All right, so somebody says African lives, African with a K, African lives matter over Black Lives Matter. All right, if we go back into history and refer to the fact that Africa is a cradle of humanity, we should just be Africans, even those who think their identities are different from us. Okay, very good.